and it's thinking, which is good. And then all right, it's muted.
Who's muted?
Yep, and I moved out of the way, so it's a little.
It's showing live now. I see it.
I get out of the way.
So good here. I got a post for the library here that says, join the Reading for Life live stream in progress now.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
What do you see?
It's posted.
Yeah, it's posted, and it's showing the poster, right? Not Michael. That's what I saw online.
Yep, that's the one. I'm gonna go to the other room and do the other.
It's too.
Mute your computer.
Mute. YouTube is muted.
Unmute your computer and then move right away, and you can step into the shot. Okay. You can begin anytime. Looks like you got recording going. Right?
Hello, and welcome to Reading for Life. Reading for Life at the Austin Public Library began in 2021 as a collaborative effort to create community through a shared love of literature. The core idea is that works of literature offer precious resources of energy and vision for the creation and sustenance of healthy communities. Reading for Life leverages this unique resource to grow community from the inside out, to link imagination to imagination in an ongoing conversation about the concerns we share and the aspirations we harbor. It's educational and entertaining in the richest sense of both terms, a live stream classroom as wide and deep as our collective spirits can imagine. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, and I'm the director here in Austin, Minnesota, and I'll be your host today. With me is our presenter, Michael Verde. Michael graduated with honors from the University of Texas Plan II Honors Program, earned a master's degree in literary studies from the University of Iowa, and another from theology with the University of Durham, England, where he graduated at the top of his international class. He taught for 15 years at the university and college prep school levels, most recently at Indiana University, and is currently completing his PhD with a focus on literature and religion. Michael founded Reading for Life in 2005. Today, we'll be talking about the book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. This is our third year working on these books together, Michael. And as I mentioned before, kind of the point with Reading for Life was the idea of building community. And I had an interesting experience recently with a friend who was talking about how in the political climate, it's so hard for her to talk to other members of her family. And that kind of came up, that what's nice is she knew she could at least bring up books. And that's part of what we've talked about a lot here, is that idea that works of literature give us a bit of a bridge to speak to people about things that we maybe otherwise don't have a lot in common with. And that's something that we think is really valuable, which is part of why we started this program in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great actual, let's say, scenario that really brings home how we can relate to each other on two different levels. And let's just go back to your friend. Let's say on one level, we are divided. So this is, let's say, the level in which we have particular kinds of identities. So you're identified with this particular political party, and I'm identified with this political party. And in this level, we're, let's say, on opposite teams. But beneath that, let's say there's another level in which the two of us and all of us have some things in common that bring us together. And those things tend to be absolutely primary and fundamental. So let me give an example. Well, we all need food and water. We all need oxygen. We all need shelter. We all desire a kind of freedom. We all desire a certain kind of love. And okay, so at that level, let's say our political or ideological differences are sort of disappear. And all of a sudden we say, okay, one of the great things that literature does and works of art more broadly is they bring back to our consciousness these primary concerns. So typically we have these primary concerns, but they're in the background. So during the day, in our workaday lives, the things that tend to move to the foreground are the things that separate us. And these, ironically, are, you could say, secondary concerns in comparison to our primary concerns. However important we might think our political identifications are, I think we would agree they're not more important than food and water and oxygen. So, and let's just say in the ordinary day and ordinary ego consciousness, our secondary concerns are primary, and our primary concerns are kind of receded into kind of oblivion. Well, what art does is what we're saying here is it flips that. It all of a sudden brings primary things back into the foreground and then allows some of these secondary things to move really to their rightful place, which is peripheral. So that really is, I think, a way of theoretically explaining what this project is about, because you could imagine people all across Austin, Minnesota having very different ideological investments. But as you said, there is the possibility, because there is this medium in which we can find each other again at the level of our primary concerns, that gives us an opportunity to try to recreate community that isn't arrested at these typical fault lines. So that's what we're up to.
And I think there's a real, I found a real, I don't know if you'd call it a rush, but there's a real pleasure in finding those kinds of connections with someone that you don't otherwise connect. And I think that's one of the things that I love best about talking to people about books, is that it doesn't really matter. All those secondary things don't matter so much when you really get focused in on that primary piece, and you can kind of come to a place where you have things in common that you didn't otherwise remember or you wouldn't necessarily talk about. So if we've found several of those things in all the other books we've used. So where do you want to start today with The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and finding those kinds of things that we can talk about that might help people bring that connection to other people that they know?
Great. So let's just start where you started us, with this idea of a rush. Of when we meet in this way at a level in which we're finding each other, let's say, these primary concerns that we share. And particularly, I suspect, as you were alluding to, the further apart we seem on the surface, when we do meet, and it even sort of accentuates the rush. Another word for rush in this instance, I think, would be ecstasy, that we experience a kind of fulfillment that all of a sudden does some weird things to time. Like all of a sudden, this is what it's all about, this particular moment, and time sort of disappears. Well, the word ecstasy comes from the Latin ecstasis, which means outside of oneself. So when we meet in that way where we feel this rush, what we're very likely experiencing is what life feels like on the other side of ego. When I get outside of my ego, which has to do with these secondary investments with our ideological sort of identity claims, when I get out of that space and you get out of that space, outside of ourselves, our ego selves, and we find each other in this primary ground, there is a sense of fulfillment. There is a sense of all of a sudden we are one. And I think that rush is a way of speaking about ecstasy. And in this particular book, a symbol of that is this laughter. Laughter is a vocalization, but it goes beyond the kind of ordinary articulations of grammar. And in some ways, laughter, you might say, is the ecstatic expression of joy. In any case, I just want to tie in what we're doing here to that feeling of rush because it's very important. Why is it important? Because, well, we only have a limited amount of time. So let's start with like the big insight and then move back to sort of detailed images. So if you're going to ask me, what is this book all about? I would say this is all about Thomas and Teresa finding each other in absolute, genuine, self-transcending love. And in that meeting, you could say they're coming together to really be wedded in the emotional, spiritual, imaginative state. In that wedding, ordinary clock time is defeated. One of the things that Kundera says, or we shouldn't confuse Kundera with the implied author. In other words,
that was going to be one of my big questions.
Yeah, I think that's very important. That's very important because this is a work of fiction. So, okay, but with that, keep in mind, we're gonna say the implied. Let's say the implied author. So the implied author suggests that Thomas was born of an image. Now, this is a remarkable idea, right? To be born of an image. This is not a natural birth. We're born because of our mothers, okay? And that's how we're born. But in works of art, things get born out of an image. So we want to keep an eye on that, of a kind of a birth that is a birth, but it is not a natural birth. In any case, Thomas is born out of an image, and the image is of him standing, looking across a courtyard at a wall, having to make a decision. Now, if there was ever a kind of image of man's mortality or of humans' mortality, if we look into the future, what we're all looking at, if we just get real, eyes wide open, is our own extinction. If we look farther enough down time, if we're not evading this insight, we're going to see the possibility of our no longer being here. Time's going to come to an abrupt end. So if we're imagining the future solely on let's say a horizontal line, and I'm talking about moving through time horizontally, like Thomas's eyes moving towards that wall. If this is the only dimension that life is available to us, there's some pretty bad news, because for all of us, it is going to come to an end. And all of these things that we experience between now and then, in that particular moment, will be extinct. It would be as if it never was. I'm taking things from the book because one of the ideas is if all of these things only happen once, do they even happen at all? That's one of the ideas in the book. So what we could say is, here's the human situation. How is it that we could ever experience in our life something that doesn't end with that wall? In other words, it's a pretty bleak horizon if it ends in death. So is there a possibility that there's another ending to this story? And if there is, how do we get there? And if the moving like this is not the way, because it's ultimately going to end in our extinction, then we could propose the possibility that there is another dimension, and we can call this a vertical dimension. So instead of moving inexorably toward that collision with the wall, perhaps there is somewhere along the line, somewhere along this movement towards the end, that something happens where we cease to move horizontally and begin to move vertically. And these are all absolute, you could imagine, apropos to the title, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, because the very title is injecting this vertical dimension. Do we need to go up or do we need to go down? Again, versus this horizontal image. Okay, so we've talked about this in other works of literature before. How is it that we can move into some sense, you use the word rush, some sense of fulfillment that defeats clock time? That's kind of what we're getting at here. Is there a kind of experience in time that takes us out of time so that time doesn't get the last word? If you're following with me. Now, the challenge to that is it would be very easy to give ourselves the illusion of having this experience by not coming face to face with the reality of our death. In other words, one way we could not be defeated by death is to not think about it. We could, and the things they carried, for instance, one of the characters, Ted Lavender, kept doing dope, and that dope would get Ted Lavender high. Well, that was the way Ted Lavender was dealing with the reality of death of Vietnam, is that he was simply just choosing to get out of it. And in this particular novel, there's lots of different ways that people get out of this, but one of the ways is through a kind of art that the book refers to as kitsch. This is works of art that give us the illusion of a paradise that basically hasn't come to terms with death. In other words, it's made up a perfect little place that's taken out all the things that we don't want to look at. And it's making us pretend that that really is the real world. And that's what it is that we're going to keep our eyes on. Well, you can see what that is. That is not really facing death. If you see what I mean, that's a false ascent. That's the illusion of moving up. So the opposite of that would be to move down. But of course, if we move down entirely, that seems a little bit dispiriting, because moving down entirely would mean moving to the earth and to be buried. So is there a kind of solution here? And I'm trying to play around with east, west, north, and south. And I'm doing this because the book uses these coordinates in very specific ways. And we can talk about how each of the characters can be made sense of with respect to what their response is to these coordinates. In other words, for example, Sabina is the one who keeps betraying and moving on. And in fact, at the end of the novel, she's moved all the way to the west coast of California, as far as she can get from the east. Well, that's an example of a particular kind of solution. She's going to just keep moving and moving. And this book is suggesting ultimately, if you do that, you're going to run into the wall. So there is no escape by continually moving west, for example. Okay. Each of the characters, in other words, we can make sense of them with respect to where are they on these imaginative coordinates. Okay, so is there a solution that's not a fake ascent, that's not just dying in a kind of nothing, or just a disappearance that doesn't, there's nothing redemptive, or running into the wall? And I think that this book proposes that there is a way that if we go deep enough into accepting each other realities for all the warts and all the things, keeping our eyes wide open and loving what we see in the other and in ourselves, all the low things that we not want to look at. This book makes a lot out of excrement. I'm not going to use the S word because this is public television, but this book makes a big deal out of that. And it makes a big deal out of the soul. And one of the theological issues that the implied narrator says that he had growing up as a little kid is, did our Heavenly Father defecate? This was his big theological issue. Well, you see what's going on, what's happening in this little implied narrator's imagination is, how do I reconcile these utterly bodily things with these other utterly divine things? Another way of saying that is, how do I connect things that go all the way down with things that go all the way up? And so a solution would be to go all the way down, but instead of dying, you have an encounter with another person, in which your ego dies, but your spirit doesn't. Your ego dies, and then you and the other person now, because you're generally united, the two of you are now moving in a different dimension of reality in which space and time don't get the last word. Now, I know that was a little bit of an abstract way of saying that this novel, at one level, is a classic love story of two people finding each other in a self-transcending way that defeats death, so that Thomas doesn't hit that wall, for instance. And part of that, part of them finding each other is coming to terms with the power differentials. You know, that both of them in some ways have, ironically, it seems like through most of the novel that Thomas is the asymmetrical. He is the dominant of the two parties because he's having these affairs with lots of women, and Teresa is receiving the blunt of the pain associated with that, and he's not giving it up. And it seems like their relationship is asymmetrical because, in a sense, he's getting away with taking advantage of these kinds of delights that she is paying for. But near the end of the novel, she has the insight that deep down, what she always was hoping to do was to bring Thomas down, to make him be in some ways so weak that he could not have affairs. This was one of the insights at the end of the novel. She began to understand that a part of her weakness was a fairly sophisticated power play, if you see what I mean. So in a way, they were both doing this to each other. You know, my dad used to say, and you know, after several divorces, people get a little jaded. He said to me, "Listen, son, it's always going to be in life romantically 51 or 49. So I encourage you to be the 51." Now, bless his heart, I doubt that he feels that way at this moment in life. But once upon a time, that was the advice that he gave to me: don't be the 49. Well, what I love about that is it really, I think, makes pretty concretely vivid something we all sort of harbor deep down. How is it that I'm not going to be taken advantage of with the other person? I mean, we even think of that in master slave, a dominant subordinate kind of thing. And you would think of real love as actually getting outside of the mentality that says it's either going to be 51 and 49, and finds a place where it could be 110 and 110. In other words, we could find a place where both of us are greater because we are together. Neither one of us is above the other. This, in other words, if I were to say what this novel is about those two characters finding each other by going all the way down, accepting all of the things about themselves. In other words, to go all the way down and close your eyes, that's a failure. To go all the way down and keep your eyes open and see what you see and still love it. Then that is the beginning of moving up. And I'm using eyes because the novel makes a big deal out of eyes. There are two prominent myths that inform the story. One, the myth of Moses and the Exodus, because, you know, Teresa comes to Thomas on a bulrush, on a basket like the baby Moses. And then another thing is the story of Oedipus, because he uses the story of Oedipus as an analogy about communists and the way people respond to communist countries. In any case, in the story of Oedipus, of course, Oedipus puts out his eyes when he realizes that he's killed his father and slept with his mother. So the eyes are a big part of this novel. And what I want to propose is that the novel is suggesting that real love has something to do with keeping our eyes open and finding each other, eyes open, accepting all the things that we might think of as unacceptable. Fake love would be we close our eyes and don't look at those things we don't like. Well, that's a kind of joining, but it doesn't go all the way down. And I think this book is suggesting unless you go all the way down, you don't have the possibility of moving vertically outside of clock time.
So I can see how that comes up in the novel as you go through, and they move from place to place and they end up in the really small town, right? Where he's doing the window washing. You know, he's gone from being a surgeon to a window washer. So is that kind of what you're trying as far as going down, and they kind of become, I think they even talk about how it's a small town, but because of communism, people are going out. They've lost some of the small town pieces, but Thomas and Teresa have it because they're the ones staying there. And does that all kind of fit in with what you're saying there?
Oh, you're inspiring me. Look how your imagination's working, because I think that's really a wonderful way of saying all of the freedoms that Thomas imagined he could never let go of. All of those things that gave him strength were slowly disappearing from his life. In other words, in a sense, they were both going down and down to primary concerns. All of these peripheral things that were enabling them to evade each other, to evade their own sort of fears, all of those things, as they began to disappear, they were going further and further down. And so I think that's right. They were losing all of the things, you could say, that were less than the most important thing.
Mhm.
And in other words, they had to lose these things in order to find what was of absolute essence, what was absolutely primary. And you can see how now, taking of this unbearable lightness of being, that this moving down by getting rid of these freedoms was a kind of heaviness.
Mhm.
And in this book, it suggested, look, heaviness is not the necessarily loss of freedom. Heaviness might be what you have to experience to get to the lightness. If you avoid the heaviness, you're never going to get to the lightness. So in a sense, the heaviness is the loss of options. Including, as you mentioned, his calling. He thought he was called to be a surgeon. And in fact, now he's a window wiper. And then even after a window washer, he started to be a driver of a truck, right? Now now we said we'd start with the abstraction because of lack of time. We want to get to the meaning of it all. Let's go back to some images. So let's just take Thomas's employment. Well, the book teases out these metaphors. So a surgeon is one who has a scalpel and he cuts into the body. He says this is something that God didn't imagine, is the capacity, the possibility that man would cut into God's creations and start to manipulate it and do kinds of, okay. But cutting into something and seeing it beneath the surface is analogous to his relationship to all of these different women. Because, as the novel says, in his imagination, he was always looking for that part of a woman that was unimaginable. He was going to find that thing in them, and he thought that sex is where it really became a real quest. This is a Don Juan quest, right? Mm-hmm. He's going to find this millionth part of this super private thing. Okay, that's very much like a scalpel in some ways. But you could see then that that is not exactly the most inspiring metaphor for two people coming together, because it has one person in the superior role dissecting the body of the other person. And we're playing with the novel's images. So in contrast to that, he becomes a window washer. Now, remember, we mentioned that eyes were a big deal. Could there be a more direct sort of image relating the eyes and the soul than a window washer? Let me give you an example. Blake, the English poet, said, if the doors of perception were thoroughly cleansed, was he talking about the doors of perception or the eyes? If the eyes were thoroughly cleansed, we would see everything as it truly is, infinite. So in some ways, that window washer is a kind of metaphor for cleaning the eye. Cleaning, if you see what I mean, he's making that the eyes are the window to the soul. Cleaning this sort of stuff is enabling he and Teresa, enabling him and Teresa to see through the illusions. So in other words, moving from that profession to a window washer was a movement of progress. It was ironically, in the world's terms, moving backwards, but actually in terms of the salvation of your being, and not to die with that wall, it was a moving forward, because this had less to do with something being superior and manipulating other bodies to extract something from it as your individual possession. And then you could think of moving people around in the trucks. Well, this is pretty interesting in a sense. If you imagine the idea of a rider and bringing bodies together and moving them from one place, you could just say playfully, this had to do with movement again, in a way that the window washer was a little bit more static. But in any case, that's an example how the novel is taking these very subtle things the story of Oedipus and the eyes, and Thomas with a surgeon with a scalpel, and the way he looks at women in these romantic contexts is very domineering, right? He's putting them into positions where they have to be submissive. And what does the novel do? It makes playful analogies between Thomas and any person's relationship to someone that's dominant and Russia's relationship to Czechoslovakia. In other words, it's taking the personal and the political and saying, look, how these things are kind of, aren't they the sort of the same? What countries do to each other is what people do with each other. I have to tell you, this book, like not all of the books that we've talked about, but virtually all the books, is absolutely a work of brilliance. I'm stunned that Milan Kundera never received the Nobel Prize because this is really art at the highest sort of level. Okay, something else in the novel that struck you of interest. Let's play around with the images now because I started out with abstract stuff. Let's get to some images and see
Sure.
how.
Well, let's start with one of the more obvious ones, I guess, is at least the version that I have has the dog on the front. And there's a whole, like the whole end, the last portion, right? I think the last section is called Karenin's Smile, right? Part 7. So it ends with Karenin's Smile. So the dog is there throughout. He's purchased by Thomas because Thomas, I think, tells him in the first couple pages, he's actually talking to the dog. He's like, look, I need you to help me out because I don't know what to do with this woman that has kind of, I found in my life all of a sudden. And then, it brings him all the way through to the end of the book. And Karenin's passing is kind of, it's almost the very closing of the book.
Wonderful. And we can gather that when they thought of the cover art, they were certainly imagine what is an image that is emblematic of the entire novel. You can imagine White Whale of Moby Dick, To Kill a Mockingbird. There's the tree that Scout in one version is swinging in this tree. Okay, so clearly, as you're suggesting, the dog must not be a peripheral symbol. So let's play around with that. I'm going to throw out some stuff that is first going to make people go, okay, spare me. But I'm going to try to talk you out of thinking that this is too much of a stretch. Okay. One of the interesting things, and we're talking about now opposites coming together, right? So we said heavy, light, up, down. Okay, so the opposites are a big deal. What we know about Karenin when he's in this little town is that he's not interested in the other dogs because they're all on chains and they yap mindlessly. So they're all alike and they're all barking. And this is also a symbol for what happens when all people become sort of in a uniform. Okay, so this is okay. But what is it? Who is it? Or what is it that Karenin likes? He likes a pig. He likes this farmer's pig whose name is what? Mephisto. And what is Mephisto in Faust or Mephistopheles? Mephisto is the name for the devil, right? Mephisto is the name for the devil. So now you can say this is all sort of just, okay, all in my head, but I don't know. Why does a dog like a pig? I mean, why did the author make up the dog liking the pig and not liking the other dogs? And why did the author name the pig Mephisto? And why was this dog born out of a German Shepherd and a Saint Bernard and had the head of the Saint Bernard and the body of the German Shepherd? I mean, why go into that kind of detail if it wasn't of consequence? So, and why Karenin's smile? What is the idea of a dog smiling? It seems like that's not natural, that dogs might do things that we think of as a smile, but we don't typically imagine dogs unless we're mad. Anyway, how do we get this Karenin smile? It's sort of like your feeling of a rush. How do we get this natural thing that does something that sort of transcends merely the natural world? Okay, so one playful way, and this is what authors do, they take words and they play around with them. One, in Saint Bernard, we need to keep an eye on some of this, let's say, religious subtext here, because the novel starts to move towards what? Apple trees and paradise, and Karenin is buried between two apple trees. And then, okay, we're getting pretty much to garden imagery, aren't we? When we start talking in these terms. Well, a dog, playfully spelled backwards, is God. Now, God, then, who's best friends with Mephisto, is a great example of opposites. pig is also considered an unclean or impure animal, particularly to the Jewish people. So the fact that this gets us back to excrement are things that we don't want to accept, right? This is what we were talking about, that we want to sort of not look at stuff that we think of as dirty. So here is the pig is the quintessential symbol, you might say, at least in the Western world, of a dirty, impure animal. And this dog, spelled backwards, is God, which we would think of as the most pure or high, and a pig being low because a pig wallows in the mud. And look what's happened. The two of those creatures are befriending one another. So if you're following, in other words, this dog starts to become a symbol, you could say, of a kind of a dog, because remember, they started to live on Karenin's time. This was important. When they lived in this place, they started to live less and less on clock time and more on Karenin's time. In other words, Karenin didn't have Karenin didn't look across the courtyard and look at a brick wall, because a dog is not foreseeing his or her extinction. In other words, the dog's not related to death in the same way that Thomas and Teresa are. This dog is sort of at peace in the natural world. This is where this dog belongs. This dog has never been cast out of Eden. However, human beings sort of have. So how could you get back to the kind of peace that Karenin experiences without compromising your intelligence? In other words, we don't want to give ourselves lobotomies and feel content like a cow. That's not a solution. But also, we don't want to have this constant anxiety of our own impending extinction, this kind of low grade anxiety. How do we get beyond that? How do we get again on Karenin's time, but Karenin's time with a human sort of awareness of all the things that the dog is not aware of? That's kind of what we're getting at. And Karenin becomes a symbol of a possible reconciliation between the soul and the body, between time and eternity. That's why at the end there, what is Teresa has a dream that Karenin gives birth to what? Two rolls in a bee, or a roll and two bees? Okay, now what are we talking there? We're talking, now again, if we were to follow this, you have to be in the mythological world. And keep in mind, it's not me in the mythological world. The novels are telling you very clearly Teresa came like a bulrush in a basket, okay, like the baby Moses. And Oedipus is all over, because of this novel, in other words, is engaged with mythology. So what we're doing is just doing what the novel's doing, but by doing it with images. Okay, the mythology we're playing around with now has to do with paradise and what constitutes sort of paradise. And why does this dog give birth to two rolls? Is it let's
Two
get
rolls. It's two rolls and a bee.
okay. This is very important. The numbers here, because you got two low. What is it? Two
Oh,
fishes.
the loaves and
And
fishes.
all right. So here, what are bees? This is a bee makes honey, right? And these loaves make bread, and bread you can think of to become bread has to take a natural thing, but it also, in order for it to be leavened, if it's going to be leavened bread, if it's going to rise, if the bread is going to rise, you have to add human ingredients that aren't natural. Are you following with me a little bit? These are quintessential symbols of communion. It's also symbols of paradise, a land flowing with milk and honey. The very idea that you could give birth out of a dog is the same way that Thomas was born out of an image. These are unnatural births. But if you're going to not die, you're going to need an unnatural birth.
Mm.
So this kind of birth, you might say, is the birth of the imagination, in which something in us. Now, here's another important image. About every 10 page, there's a reference to the stomach and a stomach pain, right? When she comes to meet Thomas the first time, her stomach is rumbling. He starts to have stomach pain near the end of the novel. Why stomach pain? These are then, I think, symbols of birth. And how is it that you could give birth out of your stomach if you're Thomas? In other words, how do we give birth to something in us that is partly involves our body, but transcends our body? In other words, a supernatural birth. Well, isn't that what love is? That love is a supernatural birth. So I think in many ways, in other words, the Karenin, the dog, becomes a symbol of a second kind of paradise, not the one behind us, the one that the author says denies things that are unpleasant, like excrement and death, for instance. Okay? So we can't go backwards. The next paradise is one that we're going to have to reach with our eyes wide open, not like children. Now, this brings us into why all the mothers and fathers. Again, that's part of Oedipus. He sleeps with his mother, kills his father. Sabina's trying to get away from her parents, and Teresa's trying to get away from her mother, who makes her body feel like all other. Okay, Thomas, he leaves his wife and leaves his parents at the same time because they. Okay, getting past your earthly mother and father has something to do with no longer being an infant anymore. In other words, if we're going to grow up spiritually, we can't keep being babies to each other, or we're just going to reproduce the Oedipus cycle. If you're following with me, breaking out of your natural parents, and I don't mean necessarily telling your real parents off. I mean, you simply break out of what you were thrown into, the family circle, because that's just repeating something. You got to get past that. And this is what I don't think, in other words, we experience real love if you're still connected to your family circle and I'm still connected to my family circle. When we come together, we're just going to repeat our patterns. So for us to really have love, you got to break out of your family circle. I got to break out of. You follow with me? So this is why these mothers and fathers are kind of a big deal. And while love is a kind of second birth, and it's not a natural birth. You have a different mother and a different father, you might say. And the book plays with all of these things in very, very once you put these images on the table, you start to see where the book is just saturated with it. I mean, the references to eyes are everywhere, particularly in the context of let's say erotic encounters. Who keeps whose eyes open and why? This is a big deal in the novel. These images, in other words, are speaking a kind of language that our imagination understands, but that our neck up doesn't get. Okay. So when you hear talk like this, you could say, okay, spare me. Okay. Do you think the author really intended that? Well, we had Tim O'Brien in a conversation here, and what did Tim? Well, the short answer is, well, yeah. The long answer is it's a little bit more complicated because Tim O'Brien, let's say the ego, Tim O'Brien, did not write the things they carried. The imagination that Tim O'Brien, in some sense, is the steward of, wrote the things they carried. So whether or not Tim O'Brien, I'm just using him, we could say Milan Kundera, whether or not Milan Kundera intended Dog backwards to be God and Mephisto the pig to represent the reconciliation of opposites, whether Milan Kundera, the person, intended that, the imagination that wrote this novel did, or we wouldn't be reading it. And if we weren't willing to look at these images and reflect on them imaginatively, not analytically, then we wouldn't be looking at this novel with our eyes wide open. In other words, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I can't remember if it was Tim that talked about that, or that idea that, you write a draft and then you go back and the author themselves notice the things that they maybe did, that they wrote, that they didn't pick up on the first time through, those threads that then they elaborate on in the next version and the next. And by the time you get done, you have this piece. I think Toni Morrison talked about it too. You have this novel that was written almost the author in conjunction with the muse, right? Because as they go back through and rewrite and notice things that they didn't notice the first time through in their own writing, that it's this joint effort to get this work created.
That's a wonderful way to put it. What we read when we buy these things at Barnes & Noble or our local bookstore is the last of who knows how many drafts. I remember attending an exhibit in Paris of Seurat, the guy that did Pontisme. It was an exhibit, but the whole exhibit was just two of Seurat's paintings. And then the rest of the exhibit were all of the drafts leading up to those two great works of art. One that had to do with the inside of a circus and then one had to do with the beach. Anyway, so what you saw were all of the drafts, and it was mind blowing. Hundreds of drafts, some like with a ruler. All of it, what you're saying here, in other words, I'm just reinforcing that what the author, is that you or me that keeps beeping?
I'm not sure.
I hope it's you and not me. But in any case, what the author, as you're saying, put something out there, and his or her imagination has slipped some things in that the author wasn't aware of. But as you said, when the author reads that draft, sees what their imagination is proposing, and then incorporates that into the next draft. So one thing you could say is a great writer is not someone who gives birth to these great works of art like Athena out of the head of Zeus. A great author is a person who can listen to language and work with language for language to get a word in edgewise. So our real question should be, did language intend these connections? And then things, I think, get a little less more believable than they may have been before.
Well, and now that we're talking about that, it seems like it's almost written into this novel in that way too, where the author or the narrator comes in. Because I noticed that right away within the first couple chapters. I'm like, wait a minute, who is the I? And it's not as much at the beginning, but then as you get towards the end, there's a whole section where it's all the narrator. And so it feels like in some ways it's the author has almost purposefully created this narrator to do the same thing, to kind of bring in these pieces with the reader. So the authors worked with the imagination to create the novel, but within the novel, there's the narrator who's working with the reader to kind of pull things in and out. And it's kind of an interesting.
You should be a literary, teach literature, or you should be a librarian.
I should be a librarian, man.
Yeah, these are wonderful connections. And one thing we can think of, listen, if of Milan Kundera's, let's say, personal I is going to hit that wall.
Right.
So if Milan Kundera doesn't give birth or participate in the birth of another I, bad news for Milan Kundera. However, if Milan Kundera gives birth to another Milan Kundera that is not simply this biological body, what do we say about an author? His or her body of work. An author takes their body and works with their body and creates a body of work. It's another way of saying they have a natural birth in which they give birth to a new I, or their imagination working through them gives birth to a new I, an I what? That won't hit the wall. Because the Milan Kundera hit the wall not too long ago, incidentally, but the Unbearable Lightness of Being didn't hit the wall. And every time we pick it up and read it, something that was as real as Milan Kundera could possibly ever be, that 1/1,000,000th part that Thomas was looking for in a woman, anytime he had a sexual encounter, that part that couldn't be imagined, well, that's the part that Milan Kundera got into this book.
Mm-hmm.
Every time we read this book, if we keep our eyes wide open, then that part didn't die in Milan Kundera. That spirit is moving now in our bodies, moving through our imagination. That's really what poets are doing. They're taking words and trying to defeat death. And this is why everybody besides the lover and the lunatic thinks poets are crazy. But the lover, and I'm taking Shakespeare, who said the lover, the lunatic, and the poet are of imagination compact. Meaning there's something that the lover, the lunatic, and the poet all have in common. Okay. What they have in common is all three of those characters believe that love can defeat death. And for everybody else, every rational person, that's a fiction. That's a myth. That's crazy. But for the lover and the lunatic and the poet, they think, no, that's not crazy. We've experienced something that if you don't experience it, you're going to have missed a real great opportunity.
I think, speaking of being a librarian, I think that's one of the reasons why I am a librarian, is because I think early on I figured out that novels are a sort of immortality for people, right? And I will never know, I will only ever know the people that are alive in my lifetime, but through books, I can get to know people that were alive, thousands of years ago. And I think that's why there are so many books about immortals. That's why people are fascinated, by this. I like a lot of fantasy books, so they're fascinated with that idea of the sorcerer or the it's why vampires are popular too. It's that idea of being able to live longer than your lifetime, and I really feel like we have that. It's just done through these novels.
Wonderful, wonderful, and that's a great sort of example in terms of magic and the way it relates to art. At the end of The Tempest, what is Prospero, the magician, throwing away the magic, which was a false ascent, and essentially saying the magic now is art. Mm-hmm. And I can't cast the magic on you, but you can participate in the art and make the magic. So Prospero is giving up power in a way. it just as we said, Thomas and Teresa had to give up power over each other. Okay, so that's one of the kind of counternatural things is for the ego to give up power. The ego, this novel is big on hierarchies. This novel is always talking about the balance of power. And some people imagine love as a battlefield. And what does the implied author say? Be very careful about your metaphors, because in the metaphor is the finale. So if you're imagining love as a battlefield, it's never going to not be 5149. Getting out of that metaphor into a different metaphor. Now, where's a concrete example of what I'm talking about? Remember that there's very early in the novel, he takes the word compassion and he says, what this word means depends upon which linguistic group you trace its etymology. In the Romance languages, compassion has a kind of resonance with sympathy, and it sort of suggests pity. So to take compassion on someone means you're a little bit above them. But in Swedish, Polish, Czech, and German, compassion means to be equal with feeling. Now, you got a whole a little section there, chapter that is making this very explicit. Do you think of compassion as one person looking down on that poor, pitiful soul? Or as my grandmother used to say, poor, nasty things? Okay. Or do you imagine feeling equal side by side? Now, all of a sudden, we're starting to use terms that the book comes to increasingly at the end of the novel of Thomas and Teresa being side by side. To be side by side, this also takes us back to the garden because Eve is born out of Adam's rib. To be united side by side is to be reborn. Okay, all of these sorts of things have to do with the ego, because as long as the ego's in play, it's 5149. The death of an ego enables us to have real compassion. This is how we're getting to where I think we started by saying to not hit that wall. You have to have this ego transcending, eyes wide open love of an imperfect other person, including yourself, that includes the excrement, if you want to say the low things in life, with the high things in life. If you're able to go that deep and keep your eyes wide open and experience real love, you're going to get into Karenin's time and not clock time.
So before we run out of time here, then, how does that fit in with the ending with Thomas and Teresa being flattened by the tree or whatever? That, you're hitting the wall. So how do we then reconcile that with, they didn't hit the wall, but they did get smashed by a tree?
Great, because the point of the matter is, as long as our vision is on this horizontal plane, that's going to happen to all of us.
Okay.
But remember, there was a scene in which involves, I can tell you the plane there, that he has a dream that they're on an airplane and they're looking down at the stars. Okay. In other words, while they were still alive, they experienced this kind of eternity. They were able, while alive, to break out of their power games and to love each other selflessly. This happens when he decides he can give up all of these erotic encounters. And he's not even interested in the perfect woman. He has this idea of the perfect woman, and he leaves the perfect woman to be with Teresa. And when he leaves the perfect woman for his love, his earthly love, not his ideal fantasy love, that's when her pain begins to go away and she feels, okay, in other words, when that thing flattens them, they're not there.
I see.
They've moved into another dimension of time. And this is what the lover, the lunatic, and the poet keep saying. It's possible in this clock time to Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and it's kind of reiterated in the book that way, because you find out that they're dead before the end of the book. And then there's still like quite a bit of the book left. So they bring them, the narrator brings them out of time in the book as well. And then you're still trying to figure out, well, because it doesn't really happen until later. So that's
absolutely. So the book, actually, you could say the ending happens before the book ends. And it's that particular dream in which they are above the stars in this airplane now, which isn't this a perfect image of moving up? But look how they moved up. They moved up by going all the way down into the reality of their own imperfections and of each other. And this is the moment happens when he chooses the actual Teresa
Mhm.
as opposed to his fantasy perfect woman. In Jungian terms, he let go of his anima and fell in love with a real woman. This is one of the Jungian tropes, is that we keep trying to marry our own anima, and a woman keeps trying to marry their own animus. Well, that's the Oedipal cycle, right? This is just okay. And so in this novel, it's really depicted that Thomas chooses Teresa over the perfect other. And he says, doesn't remember Aristophanes' symposium, or at the symposium, Aristophanes tells the story that once upon a time we were united in male and female, and then we were thrown into separate parts, and we spend the rest of our life trying to, okay. And what happens is that perfect part is not what he chose. He chose a mortal woman to be his other, which is very different than falling in love with your own image, you might say. And that's the moment then they moved up. That was not a false ascent. That was not illusory. These are really works of genius. But if we don't learn the language of images, you see, if we just going to say, what I'm going to get the meaning here, but we're not interested in eyes. We're not interested in the dog. We're not interested in why rolls and honey. We're not interested in why a window washer and a scalpel. Okay. If that doesn't interest us, we shouldn't read fiction at all, because this ultimately is not a work of philosophy. There is philosophy incorporated in it. But this is a work of art, which means your imagination has to work with the images. Now, if you're going to say, I don't think that I don't want to think I'm reading something into it. If you're using your imagination, you're not reading something into the novel. You're just trying to learn the novel. Now, that doesn't mean every hypothesis you have is going to be borne out. We could have fantastical ideas that the novel sort of rejects, but we can test these. If we think that the honey means something about consumerism, for instance, and we plug that into the novel. Well, that's not going to make any sense in a bunch of different passages. But if you plug in this idea that this honey has something to do with the land of milk and honey or finding paradise, then all of a sudden, Teresa coming into a bulrush, what is Moses? Moses is leading the Hebrew people to the land of milk and honey. You see how the Teresa comes on a bulrush, ends with the dog, Karenin with the two loaves and the bee.
Yeah.
And a bee is, real quickly, I was just going to say this same thing with time, playing around with time. You see it also in Pulp Fiction. You remember that we already see that one of those two, the Travolta character we already know the Travolta character is shot by Bruce Willis's character earlier. And then at the end of the novel, you see these two, what their name, Vince and Vince and the black guy and the white guy are walking away, but we already know the Travolta character has been shot in the bathroom on the commode. So that's another example of playing around with time. And that's what really art does. It takes clock time and puts it into different shapes. But if we bring these shapes together in a way, and if we get it right, and this is imaginatively right, not intellectually right, and the imagination includes the intellect, but also our body, then time sort of moves inside of this body, and then it doesn't matter where it is, if it's at the end or the beginning, because the whole thing now has defeated clock time. So you have a vision of the novel. It doesn't matter at the end what happens to them if they get flattened by a truck, etc., because that's not even there anymore.
Very cool. Interesting.
We just scratching the surface, and unfortunately, we're out of time.
Now,
Speaking of time,
yes. Speaking of time, so yes, well, thank you. That was wonderful, and I think that's a wonderful start. And we'll continue on with the podcast to discuss the unbearable lightness of being, and hopefully everyone who was a part of this today got something out of it. And we'll go back and maybe reread the novel and find someone else in the community, or come on out to the library and have a conversation with me about the novel. And Michael, as always, thank you so much. And we look forward to doing this again. Our next novel will be Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Well, last thing I want to ask you,
yes,
did you wear a t-shirt with a rainbow on that on purpose for a symbol of paradise? Or this is a really wonderful tie-in. Do you theme dress for all of our books?
Oh, if I were only that organized.
Okay.
No.
Great.
But
Great.
I'm glad that that fit in. That's actually.
Your imagination would.
Yes, my imagination dressed me this morning.
I love that. May we all be able to say that every morning. Okay,
Yes.
everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Austin, Minnesota. Thank you, KSMQ. Thank you for the public library. I think we're doing neat things here together, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it.
Awesome things. Thank you so much, Michael.
And then end the meeting in Zoom, or you can talk as long as you want. Now that the recording's stopped. Or no, we're still live, aren't we?
Right, so we need to